This week on Martyr's Row, was Samson a short king? Wait, where's Paul? I don't know. Let's find out. 3, 2, 1.
Saint Pancras, a youth of tender years, yet ripe in faith, came from Phrygia unto Rome, where he was instructed in the way of Christ. In the persecution under Diocletian, he was brought before the judge and commanded to deny the Lord and sacrifice to the idols. But neither threats nor promises could move him, for he answered that Christ was his life. Though scarcely 14 years of age, he endured the sentence of death with consistency beyond his years, and was beheaded for the confession of the gospel. Thus this young martyr put to shame the wisdom of the world, showing that strength is not measured by years, and that the grace of God perfects courage even in youth. Anno Domini 304.
Hey guys, this is Steven from Martyr's Row, and this is a solo episode. First one we've ever done, and hopefully last one, but maybe not. Maybe this is something that we do periodically from, whatever it happens, whenever it happens. But, I was thinking about something recently, and I don't know if this is something that you've experienced, but this is definitely something I've experienced. And the weird thing about it is you're not sure exactly who is right. What I mean by that is this. Have you ever experienced a memory that doesn't actually come from your mind and experience, but comes from seeing a photograph? Like you've seen a photograph, or your parents have a photo album on your coffee table or just around your house, and you saw this picture growing up, and you just see it over and over and over again. And so that picture becomes a memory in your mind. And then you can't really distinguish, did I actually remember that memory, or is that something that I just remember through the stories around the photo? And what actually makes up a memory? How does that actually work? And to be honest with you, I don't really know. I think one of the things that it reminds me of, though, is the idea of faith, the idea of myth, and the idea of story, history. How do we define these things? How do we prove any of it is true? And I think at the end of the day, I think that it all kind of comes down to the idea of what was I created for? What can I define? And what can I understand? And when we look at those things, I think that we realize the answer is nothing. I think the actual answer is we are extremely unreliable in and of ourselves. I mean, I'm sitting here doing a solo episode, and I don't know if anything I'm going to say is going to make any sense because no one is bouncing off of me. And the truth is when I actually think about that, there's this baseline of understanding where if everything that I believe is based off of reasons why I would believe anything, then I'm my own God and I'm my own standard, and whatever I think goes, which is not great because from day to day I feel either really good or I feel terrible. And would that change my history and my truth? Would me saying this is a photo, and so I remember the photo, but I don't actually remember being there in the photo, therefore did that event actually happen in my history? And I think you could argue in some ways logically that is evidence, physical evidence, but the fact is it's not physical evidence. It's a photo. And if I wasn't a kid that grew up in the 90s, then I would say, well, that photo could be AI, it could be photoshopped, it could be whatever. But the photos that I have from my childhood they're analog enough for me to go, no, I think that's actual evidence that I actually was there and I actually did do that, because in the 90s it would have been really hard for my mom to have to create and build something that would make it look like I'm somewhere where I'm not. But now I'm not sure that that's true. So if everything is built off of evidences and photos and all of those things, then the reality is maybe all of it's not true. But I think this is what brings validity to the Bible, which is it's not just me, and it's not just a photo, and it's not something that somebody could have just created. In fact, over thousands of years, people over and over and over and over and over, more than any ancient book, has gone back and said that this is actually true. This is actually worth fighting for. This is actually something that we should hold on to, and this is actually something that we should not change. We should preserve it. And moving it from language to language, we have to be true to the language of the original text and the way it was originally given, because although we are modern people, we have to respect the way it was originally given. And so I think when we look at the stories through the Bibles and through the Bible, and we look at the historical pieces that are there, and then we see the evidences of things like the Talmud and the ancient texts, and even guys like Josephus who talk about what went on back in the biblical times, that we take that to heart, as those were people that were trying to explain why we're here and what we're doing, but not intentionally not doing it as this is what I think, but instead, hey, I'm trying to humbly preserve what the Lord has said and the Creator and what the Creator has said about us. And one of the things I love is that the Bible is full of people getting things wrong over and over and over and over again. And I think if we were trying to like have a text that was like, this is the truth, this is the actual truth, I think you'd remove all of that. To me, I think that's one of the greatest apologetics for the validity of the Christian text, the Jewish text, is that it is full of people getting things wrong over and over again, and kings being humbled and judges being humbled, and the people who were supposed to be first being last. It's the opposite of the rest of history. Because what do we know? We know that, what is it? The history is written by the winners. But that's not actually true in the Bible. The history was not written by the winners. In fact, Israel means he who wrestles with God. So if Israel means he who wrestles with God, why wouldn't the main people group or the main individual that the whole thing comes from, why wouldn't his name be he who wins, or the winner backed by God, but he who wrestles with God? I just feel like even in our own lives, we've talked about this before on Martyr's Row, but the idea that myths, we all have myths actually in our own lives, things that we know for sure happened, but we can't explain tangibly how and when or even where they happened sometimes because of our memory. Is it something that I'm recalling from my mind, the recesses of my mind, or is it just a photo I looked at growing up? I don't know. Who knows? But I think it's worth exploring and maybe looking at the differences in what people would say and declare, because a lot of people say the Bible's not true, and then over and over again, their lives are not something I would want to imitate. Their lives are and their truths are not something that holds from year to year to generation from one people group to another. Instead, they all fall apart with the fall of every civilization. But the Word of God remains true, and heaven and earth will pass away, but His Word will not. So, is that memory? Did it happen, or was it just a photo? Who knows? 3, 2, 1. They drew him tall on classroom walls, a giant in the sacred art. But Scripture never names his height, just says the Spirit stirred his heart. Measured by myth, not by text.
rust on his hands, strength enough to break the ropes of war, too weak to rule his own demons, measured by myth, not by text or breath. We crown our heroes larger than flesh. Blinded eyes still learn to pray, and heaven still listens anyway. Heaven still listens anyway. Maybe the kingdom hid in plain sight, never a crowd, never a throne. God writes his power in the borrowed strength, and calls the broken still his own. Maybe the kingdom hid in plain sight, never a crowd, never a throne. God writes his power and borrows strength, and calls the broken still his own. Measured by myth, not by text or breath. We crown our heroes larger than flesh. Blinded eyes still learn to pray, and heaven still listens anyway. Measured by myth, not by text or breath. We crown our heroes larger than flesh. Blinded eyes still learn to pray, and heaven still listens anyway.
And the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord gave them into the hand of the Philistines for 40 years. There was a certain man of Zorah, of the tribe of the Danites, whose name was Manoah, and his wife was barren, and had no children. And the angel of the Lord appeared to the woman and said to her, Behold, you are barren, and have not borne child, but you shall conceive and bear a son. Therefore be careful, and drink no wine or strong drink, and eat nothing unclean, for behold, you shall conceive and bear a son. No razor shall come upon his head, for the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb, and he shall begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines. Then the woman came and told her husband, A man of God came to me, and his appearance was like the appearance of the angel of God, very awesome. I did not ask him where he was from, and he did not tell me his name. But he said to me, Behold, you shall conceive and bear a son. So then, drink no wine or strong drink, and eat nothing unclean, for the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb to the day of his death. This is not talking about Jesus, although you think it might be. It is talking about Samson. Yeah, Samson. And every time I hear Nazarite, I think of Nazareth, which is kind of interesting. And maybe I should have looked that up. Maybe we'll get into that. We'll see. But my question, I think, that has been on my mind for a while now is, was Samson a short king? Now, the funny thing is Samson actually wasn't a king at all. He was a judge, and he was a judge for about 20 years, that he was a judge of Israel. And the period of the judges is kind of interesting because it comes before the period of the kings. So in the Old Testament, you have the Israelites finally, after 40 years, which again there's all these 40-year periods showing up. I mean, even right here that we just read in Judges chapter 13, that there's another period of 40 years because what? The people of Israel were sinning against God. They were going after other gods. Every time they did that, it seemed like there was a period of 40 days or 40 years that had to be paid almost as a sacrifice of time in order to bring back and restore what had been lost. And basically what that was is a resetting of a generation. But the guy Samson, So Samson's not a king, but Samson is a judge, and the judges come basically after the children of Israel finally make it into the promised land, land flowing with milk and honey. Moses gets them there, but doesn't get in. And so Joshua gets in. And when Joshua gets in, Joshua actually takes them in and he leads the children of Israel. And he is their leader in the same way that Moses was. And Moses was not a king. Joshua also not a king. Joshua also not the son of Moses, instead his brother. Wait, actually Aaron was his brother. So Joshua, in that way, is not following a king lineage. And it's interesting in that way because that's what kingship looks like. It looks like this guy's the ruler and everybody should bow down to him as the king. But instead, with Israel, God was their king. Yahweh was their king. And I think that that's kind of interesting because that means that when they get into the kingdom of Israel, when they finally get to the promised land, the land of Canaan, and they take back that land, or they take that land really for the first time, as promised to Abraham long before that moment, when they get into that space, they don't have a physical king, but instead they have Yahweh as their king, and then they have a leader who listens to Yahweh and obeys his commands. And then through that leader, the commands of God are reinforced. So we see that with Joshua. But once Joshua dies, then the people of Israel, they turn away from God again. The same reason, the same way that when Moses went up on the mountain for 40 days, the people of Israel went to Joshua and they said, well, we want to worship this God that brought us out of Egypt. Will you make us a golden calf so that we might worship Yahweh? Well, Yahweh's not a golden calf. So they ended up turning towards their own ways, and Moses comes down and breaks the tablets, the commands, and how to obey Yahweh. And so what we see is that happening again, almost from generation to generation. It's like after a generation, everything resets again. So we get this period of the judges, and Samson is one of those judges, but this phrase, a short king, that's a modern phrase. And I think it's interesting because one of the things that we always think about with strong characters in the biblical text is associating their strength with their stature. And sometimes their stature is described. But in the case of Samson, his stature is actually never described. It's not described in the text. It's not described in antiquity. How tall or how big or how strong Samson was physically was never actually described. Not in any historical Philistine texts outside of the scriptures. Not actually in the book of Judges. Not anywhere in the Bible does it express the physical nature of Samson when it comes to strength, when it comes to stature, when it comes to how big he was. That's just not part of what we know about Samson, which is pretty interesting. The other thing is, Samson is not in the lineage of Jesus. And you would kind of think he was because of how important he is and seemingly how much we hear about him and how big of a character he is, even through history and through Sunday school and all of those things. And maybe it's just because he's so interesting. But he's not even a judge in the Old Testament that rules for a long time. He's only a judge for 20 years, which is not very long. And his death is pretty tragic. But in the way of the prophets that come after him, so you have the judges and then you have the kings, and then you have the prophets that kind of come through those periods of times during the kings, but not really during the time of the judges. So in the judges, you kind of have this character, this person who is both a judge who settles disputes, and then he's also kind of a king in that he's leading, he's casting vision, he's hearing from God and he's casting vision. But with the kings, there was always a rabbi, or there was a priest, or there was a prophet who would bring the word of the Lord to the king. And so, like even with King David, who was very much after the heart of God, as the Bible describes him, he had Samuel, and he had other priests, and he had other prophets that would give the word of the Lord to him. So David didn't even really get that word directly most of the time. And but the judges seem to have gotten them directly. And we can see that in that they would bring judgment upon Israel, but then also upon others with the power and the might of Israel. In other words, a lot of the judges were mighty warriors. And maybe that's why we think that Samson is massive in stature, because Samson does things like rip the jawbone off of a donkey and slay a bunch of people with a jawbone, which is just insane and extremely brutal. But that doesn't mean that he's this massive guy. It actually doesn't even mean that he's strong physically at all. There's not really any reason for us to believe that he was, unless we're filling in the gaps because we're uncomfortable with the supernatural explanation that even the text itself gives us. So then Samson, well, if Samson's not in the line of Jesus, then what line is he from? So Samson, it tells us, is of the Danites. That his father, as we read, was Manoah. And Manoah is of the house of Zorah. A certain man of Zorah. Zorah is a location, sorry. And he's the tribe of the Danites. Now, Dan is one of the 12 sons of Jacob. So Jacob has 12 sons, and one of the 12 sons, and obviously Jacob becomes Israel, so then the 12 sons become the 12 tribes of Israel. One of those sons is Dan. And Dan is interesting because the role of Dan in Israel is actually, they're always on the outpost. They're always guarding from exterior forces that are trying to get into Israel. So at first in Judges, we see that Dan is actually in the southern region, which was weird because when I was in Israel, I went to the area of Dan and it was in the north region. And so as I went back in and looked at this, you see that Dan is actually starts out in the lower region. And Dan is in the lower region, which is where the Philistines were, in the Gaza area, which again is kind of interesting for modern day. But we see that in that area and in that region, that the Danites were tasked with keeping the Philistines out of the land of Israel, but they failed miserably. They failed over and over again. And what we see with Samson is that Samson in this moment begins to do these weird things that are that seem like they're counterintuitive, that they seem like he shouldn't be doing them, but also that he's making decisions as a leader that is completely against the Danite culture. One is that in chapter 14 of Judges, it says, Samson went down to Timnah, and at Timnah he saw one of the daughters of the Philistines. Then he came up and told his father and his mother, I saw one of the daughters of the Philistines at Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife. But his father and mother said to him, is there not a woman among the daughters of our relatives or among all of our people that you must go to take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? But Samson said to his father, get her for me, for she is right in my eyes. Now, if this is Solomon, or if this is a story told by Solomon or by Jesus, we would go, well, okay, this is his hubris. This is something that he's desiring, not something that he's supposed to be doing. This is his downfall. Except that right after that, it says, his father and mother did not know that it was from the Lord, for he was seeking an opportunity against the Philistines. At that time, the Philistines ruled over Israel. So Dan was not doing their job. The Danites were not doing their job in the southern region, and the Philistines were ruling over the Danites. So the southern region of Israel was chaos. And Samson, seemingly doing something that he wanted to do, was actually doing something that the Lord was telling him to do. Almost like a prophet would do something that looks insane or is perceived to be insane, but actually has a purpose and a representation, that how the Lord is going to work through this individual is the opposite of how the world would perceive it. So one of the things that we see, and we're not really going to get into that too much, I really just want to chat about what Samson looked like. But the interesting thing with Samson is again, answering the question of, is he from the line? Why is he not in the line of Jesus? Well, Samson doesn't have kids. He never produces kids, but he's also from the line of Dan, which means he's not from the line of David, right? Because David is from Bethlehem, and David's line is a priestly line. And so it's important that the line, this is actually a character from outside the line of Jesus, but part of the 12 tribes of Israel. Because Jesus doesn't come through Isaac and then through all 12 tribes. He comes through one tribe. So it's interesting because you think he comes through Israel, and he does come through Jacob. Jacob is his ancestor, but he doesn't come through Dan. It goes through, and actually I'm going to look that up. But one of the things that, okay, so let's look it up in real time. What tribe of Israel is Jesus from? And I want to say it's the Levites. No, Judah, of course. Jesus was from the tribe of Judah, of course, duh. The royal tribe from which the Messiah was prophesied. So Judah, right, the Lion of Judah. Come on, guys. I should have known that. The King David, the Lion of Judah. Literally, that's what, it's not like Lion of Judah, the region of Judah, but literally Judah, the son of Jacob or the son of Israel. So Judah is Dan's brother, right? So Judah and Dan, they're doing two different things. So that's the thing that's interesting about Samson, is because Samson is this character that we would think Jesus, he would be in the bloodline, right? But then also because of the great strength of Samson, maybe we think like, well, and then his interaction with the Philistines and all of that stuff down there, we might think, well, did Samson have some cross-contamination in his bloodline, making him potentially was he like descendant of the Nephilim? And we have no indication of that. In fact, we would have more indication that he has nothing to do with that his bloodline was pure. However, Samson didn't have kids, so there was no more coming from Samson. But also, Samson is a Danite. He's not of the house of Judah, so Jesus wouldn't be like in his bloodline, or Samson's not in the genealogy of Jesus or of David because he's a Danite. So that's kind of an interesting thing. And they have all these issues with the Philistines. But there's so many things with the Philistines, and there's so many things that Samson does. And it's interesting, all the things that he does. But one of the main things is his hair. So I'm going to try and stay focused, especially because it's just me tonight. But I'm going to try and stay focused in that there's a lot of things you could talk about with Samson. But let's just talk about what he looked like and his stature. And let's pay attention to that. So his hair. So his hair is not a magic charm. And the text repeatedly anchors his power in God's presence. So in Judges 14, verse 6, it says, "And behold, a young lion came toward him roaring." This is after he tells his father about the lady in Timnah. "Then the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and although he had nothing in his hand, he tore the lion in pieces as one tears a young goat. But he did not tell his father or his mother what he had done." So this is an interesting thing because he comes upon a lion and he literally rips it apart. But it doesn't say that he rips it apart. It says, "Then the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and although he had nothing in his hands." So it is not his strength. It's not his stature. It's not how he was physically built. It was that the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him. And then he was able to rip the lion apart. And you're like, well, why did he even do that? Well, the lion becomes a sign because he takes the dead carcass of the lion and he shoves the beehive into the lion, into the body of the lion, and then he scrapes out honey from that. So this is honey that is unclean. I mean, you're talking about in Israel, there's the land of milk and honey. It's honey, but he shoves it into the lion, this dead carcass, and then he pulls the pulls the honey out of the it says there was a swarm of bees in the body of the lion. And he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion, and behold, so after a few days, he shows up, and bees had built. He doesn't put the bees in there. What am I talking about? He doesn't put the bees in there, but he sees that there's a swarm of bees in there, and so he takes the honey out from the carcass, and he gives that. He ultimately gives that honey to his parents, but this is all a sign. It's something that he's doing. He's trying to set them up. Anyways, we're not going to do a Bible study on Samson. That's not what we're doing at Martyr's Road. That's for your Sunday school. But okay, so over and over again, we see this idea that Samson, pretty much every time that he's about to do something with great strength, he does it when the Spirit of the Lord rushes upon him. So with Samson, we're never told anywhere that he is big in stature. In fact, if you would look at the average height of someone from his family, someone from that tribe at that time, you're probably looking at someone in the mid to high, at most, 5 foot range. So maybe he's like 5'10". So like that would be at the high end. At the low end, he's like 5'3" or 5'4". And we just don't have this stature. It's not given to us. So the other thing about Samson that is potentially really interesting is, what if Samson is actually not big in stature? What if physically, and again, nobody says this, but what if he's actually just a normal looking guy, and the importance of every time he does a feat of strength is that the Spirit of the Lord rushes upon him, is such a sign to the people seeing it and the people around him. Because even when the Philistines capture him, even when he's imprisoned and they chain him between the posts, they don't say it's because his stature was so great that they needed to restrain him. What they were afraid of is how strong he was when the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him. And they finally figured out that the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him because when his hair grew out and everything was how it was supposed to be, and the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, then he was able to have this great strength. So the thing with Samson is, Samson's a short king for sure, but he was a Danite judge of Israel who judged Israel for 20 years, and his strength didn't come from his hair. It didn't come from his physical stature. It came from the Spirit of the Lord rushing upon him and using him. So is Samson a big guy? Probably not, because if every description of his strength is preceded by the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, then it's far more likely that we would believe that Samson was not impressive in appearance, but instead he needed for the Spirit of the Lord to rush upon him so that he would have the strength to make up for his lack of physical stature. So is Samson a short king? For sure. But is he a mighty looking warrior? Probably not, if every time that they described him doing something of great strength, it was that the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, not because he was so strong, like a Goliath, who was a Philistine. So next time you think about Samson, maybe he's smaller than everybody else, but was a special, unique person called by God to do something by and only used by the power of God as a witness to the world of the power of God, not of his physical strength. Maybe, maybe not. 3, 2, 1.